The empath is sitting in their car in the driveway, engine off, hands still on the steering wheel. They just got home from helping someone, again. A friend who called crying, a family member who needed emotional rescue, a coworker who dumped their entire crisis into a 15-minute hallway conversation. And the empath handled it. They listened, they soothed, they said the right words, they absorbed the pain like they always do. But something is different tonight. They're sitting in the driveway and they can't make themselves go inside because there's nothing left. The tank didn't just hit empty, the tank cracked. Carl Jung spent a significant part of his career studying people like this. He was drawn to the ones who carried everyone else's emotional weight while their own body slowly buckled under the pressure. What fascinated him was the turning point, the specific psychological moment when these individuals stopped being able to sustain the pattern. Jung recognized that this moment, the one where the empath gets genuinely tired of giving, triggers one of the most significant psychological shifts a person can experience, and almost nobody around them understands what's actually happening when it begins. Today, I'm going to walk you through what Jung uncovered about this transformation, what's really going on beneath the exhaustion, why this kind of tired goes so much deeper than burnout, the 3 phases the empath moves through once the giving finally breaks them open, and what waits on the other side of a life that was built entirely around being available to others. Let's begin with why empaths were giving so much in the first place. And this is where Jung's framework becomes essential, because the obvious answer, they give because they're generous, because they care, because that's just who they are, is the surface story. The real one lives much deeper. Jung would have called this a compensatory pattern rooted in early wounding. Somewhere in childhood, the empath learned that their value was directly tied to what they could provide for others emotionally. Maybe they had a parent whose moods controlled the entire household, and they became the child who could sense a storm before it hit. Maybe they grew up watching someone they loved suffer, and they took on the role of emotional paramedic because nobody else would. Maybe the only time they received affection was when they were useful, when they were solving a problem, when they were making someone else's pain go away. The giving didn't start as generosity, it started as survival, and over decades, that survival strategy calcified into an identity. The empath doesn't just give, they are the person who gives. Take away the giving, and they don't know who's standing there. Jung recognized this as one of the deepest traps in human psychology. When your wound becomes your identity, healing feels like dying. So the empath keeps going, year after year, relationship after relationship. They pour themselves into friendships where the emotional labor flows in one direction. They stay in partnerships where their needs are treated like inconveniences. They show up at family gatherings and absorb the dysfunction so nobody else has to feel it. Their hands are always extended, always offering, always holding someone else's weight, always reaching toward the next person who needs them. And here's what Jung observed about this pattern that makes it so devastating. The empath often doesn't realize they're depleted until they're past the point of recovery through normal rest. A weekend off doesn't fix this. A vacation doesn't fix this. Because the exhaustion isn't physical or even emotional in the way most people understand it. It's structural. The entire architecture of their life is designed to extract from them, and every relationship, every role, every expectation is a pipe running directly from their internal reserves to someone else's needs. When an empath finally gets tired of giving, what's actually happening is that the structure itself is beginning to collapse, and the collapse changes everything. The first phase looks like withdrawal, and it terrifies everyone around the empath. It usually starts small. They don't return a phone call as quickly. They feel a friend start to pull them into a crisis, and something inside them physically resists, like a muscle that's been overworked finally refusing to fire. They cancel plans they would have forced themselves through 6 months ago. They sit with their phone buzzing and feel absolutely nothing. No guilt, no urgency, no compulsion to respond. The people in their life notice immediately, and they don't like it. Because the system that was built around the empath's endless availability depends on that availability continuing. When the empath starts pulling back, the system sends correction signals, guilt trips, passive aggression. You've changed. You used to be there for me. I guess I can't count on you anymore. Sometimes it's subtler. just a coldness, a distance, a punishment disguised as independence. Jung would have recognized this as the system attempting to preserve itself. Every psychological pattern exists within a relational ecosystem, and when one person changes, the ecosystem pushes back. The empath isn't just withdrawing from people, they're withdrawing from a role they've played their entire life, and every person who benefited from that role, consciously or unconsciously, will resist the change. What the empath feels during this phase is confusing and disorienting. They feel relieved and guilty at the same time. They feel free and terrified simultaneously. Part of them is whispering, "Finally," while another part is screaming that they're becoming a bad person. This internal war is brutal because both sides feel completely true. Jung described the process of individuation as requiring a separation from collective expectations, the slow, painful act of pulling yourself out of the roles others have assigned you so you can discover who you actually are underneath. For the empath, this separation is uniquely difficult because the role they're leaving is the role of caretaker. And in most families, most friendships, most communities, the caretaker who stops caretaking becomes the villain of the story. So the empath sits in the driveway, hands still on the wheel, knowing that inside that house, or inside that phone, or inside that relationship, someone is waiting for the version of them that has something left to give. And for the first time, they aren't sure that version exists anymore. The second phase is where the real psychological work happens, and Jung's framework is critical for understanding it. This is the reckoning. Once the initial withdrawal stabilizes, once the empath stops actively pouring themselves out, something unexpected surfaces. Instead of feeling rested, they feel worse. Instead of the relief they anticipated, they're flooded with emotions they've been outrunning for years. Anger they didn't know they carried. Resentment that shocks them with its intensity. A sadness that seems to have no bottom. Jung would have explained this as the shadow material finally having room to surface. When you spend your entire life focused outward, managing other people's emotions, anticipating other people's needs, solving other people's problems, your own interior becomes a storage unit for everything you never had time to process. The giving wasn't just generosity, it was also avoidance. Every hour spent tending to someone else's wound was an hour you didn't have to look at your own. This is the part that breaks empaths open, because it challenges the story they've told themselves. The story was, I give because I love. I sacrifice because I care. I put others first because that's what good people do. And there's truth in that story, genuine truth. But Jung insisted that every conscious motivation has an unconscious counterpart, and the unconscious counterpart of compulsive giving is often this: I give so I don't have to receive. I focus on your pain so I don't have to feel mine. I make myself indispensable so nobody can abandon me. Sitting with that realization is one of the hardest things an empath will ever do. Their hands, the ones that were always extended toward others, have to turn inward. And what they find when they do is decades of unfelt feelings, unmet needs, and unprocessed experiences that have been waiting, patiently, relentlessly, for the empath to finally stop running. The resentment is particularly difficult, because the empath starts seeing the pattern clearly, sometimes for the first time. They see how one-sided their relationships actually were. They see how many people in their life confused love with access. They see how they trained people to take from them by never saying no, by never asking for anything, by making their own needs so small and so quiet that everyone, including themselves, forgot those needs existed. And the anger comes. Jung would have called this shadow integration, and he warned that it's one of the most destabilizing experiences in psychological development. The empath, who built their entire identity around being kind and selfless and available, has to make room for the parts of themselves that are furious about what that identity cost them. This is where people get stuck. Some empaths touch this anger and immediately retreat back into giving because the anger feels too threatening to who they believe themselves to be. They'd rather be exhausted than enraged. They'd rather be depleted than difficult. Jung saw this retreat happen again and again in his patients, and he recognized it as one of the primary obstacles to individuation. the refusal to integrate the shadow because the shadow contradicts the persona. The empaths who push through this phase, who let the anger exist without acting on it destructively, who sit with the resentment long enough to hear what it's actually saying, come out the other side fundamentally restructured. The anger, once it's been acknowledged, starts to transform. It becomes information. It becomes clarity about where boundaries needed to exist all along. It becomes fuel for the kind of honest self-examination that was impossible when all their energy was flowing outward. And if you're someone who's been doing this work, turning those hands inward, sitting with what you find, trying to make sense of decades spent pouring yourself out, you already know how lonely and disorienting that process feels. You already know that frameworks matter, that having structured ways to examine your own patterns can mean the difference between insight and spiraling. That's exactly what our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, designed to help you trace the origins of your patterns and start building something more honest in their place. Click below to get True Self-Discovery, and let's keep going. The third phase is where the empath begins to rebuild, and the rebuilding looks nothing like what they expected. Most empaths assume that getting tired of giving means they'll eventually rest, recover, and return to a modified version of the same life. A little more balanced maybe, better boundaries, but essentially the same person, the same relationships, the same role, just with more self-care sprinkled in. Jung would have pushed back hard on that assumption. What he observed was that once the empath genuinely cracks open, once the shadow material surfaces and the old identity loses its grip, the person who emerges doesn't want the old life back. They can't go back, actually, because the consciousness shift that occurred during the reckoning makes the old patterns visible in a way they never were before. They start seeing the mechanics of their relationships with almost unbearable clarity. They notice when someone's story is designed to trigger their rescue response. They feel the pull of an old pattern and recognize it for what it is before it takes hold. They watch someone try to guilt them into overextending, and instead of feeling bad, they feel a strange calm. The hook doesn't catch anymore because they can see it. This is what Jung described in his writing about the development of psychological consciousness. The awakened individual doesn't stop feeling. They feel more clearly. Their perception sharpens rather than dulls. And that sharpness means they can no longer participate in dynamics that require them to be unconscious to function. The empath starts making choices that look selfish to everyone watching from the outside. They leave relationships that were sustained entirely by their labor. They stop showing up for people who only called when they needed something. They say no, and the no comes out clean, without the paragraph of explanation and apology that used to follow it. Just no. Just the closed hand where the open one used to be. And the responses from others are predictable and painful. You've become so cold. You only think about yourself now. I don't even recognize you anymore. Jung wrote extensively about this phenomenon, the way the individuating person becomes incomprehensible to those who depended on the old version. The empath's growth looks like abandonment to the people who were feeding on their availability. And no amount of explaining will bridge that gap, because the people saying, "You've changed," are really saying, "You've stopped being useful to me in the way I'm accustomed to." Some relationships survive this transition. The real ones, the ones built on genuine reciprocity, where both people actually see each other, those adapt. They might go through a rocky period while the new dynamic settles, but they hold because there was a real foundation underneath the pattern. The relationships that were built entirely on the empath's giving, though, those collapse, and they should. They were architectural failures from the start, structures that required one person's self-abandonment to remain standing. There's a specific moment in this process that Jung identified as the true turning point, and it's worth pausing on because so many empaths miss it when it happens. It's the moment they stop expecting others to acknowledge the shift. Early in the transformation, the empath still wants validation. They want someone, a parent, a partner, a friend, to say, "I see how much you gave. I see what it cost you. I'm sorry I took so much." They want the ledger acknowledged. They want someone to look at their empty hands and understand what those hands carried. That validation almost never comes. And the moment the empath stops waiting for it is the moment they actually become free. Jung recognized this as a critical threshold in individuation, the point where external validation stops being the organizing principle of the psyche. The empath who still needs others to see their sacrifice is still defining themselves through the giving. The empath who grieves that recognition will never come and then keeps walking anyway, that's the one who's actually individuating. This is where something quiet and strange happens. The empath's hands, which were empty from giving everything away, start to fill back up, slowly, with things that belong to them, interests they abandoned, energy they forgot they had, a capacity for joy that had been buried under decades of other people's emergencies. They start doing things for no reason other than wanting to, which sounds simple, but for someone who spent their whole life doing things because someone else needed them to, it feels revolutionary. Jung described this stage using the language of psychological rebirth. And while that sounds dramatic, the actual experience is often quieter than you'd expect. The empath doesn't suddenly become a different person. They become a more complete version of who they always were. The empathy is still there. It's woven into their neurology, their perception, their way of moving through the world. But the compulsion behind it dissolves. They can feel someone's pain without being conscripted into fixing it. They can love someone without emptying themselves to prove it. What most people misunderstand about this transformation is the timeline. They think the empath gets tired, takes a break, and bounces back. They treat it like burnout, like the solution is a spa day and better boundaries. But what Jung mapped out in his work on individuation is a process that unfolds over months and sometimes years. The empath doesn't just adjust their behavior, they dismantle and reconstruct their entire psychological framework. The giving pattern was load-bearing. It held up their relationships, their self-concept, their sense of safety, their connection to others. When you remove a load-bearing wall, you don't just patch the hole, you rebuild the structure from the foundation, and that takes time. It takes sitting with emptiness that feels like failure. It takes watching relationships fall away and resisting the urge to chase them. It takes learning that rest isn't earned through productivity and that love isn't earned through sacrifice. Jung was insistent that this process cannot be shortcut. He saw patients try to intellectualize their way through it, understanding the pattern without actually feeling the feelings underneath it. He saw others try to spiritualize it, reframing their exhaustion as a spiritual awakening without doing the shadow work required. Both approaches leave the core wound intact. The empath who understands why they overgive but doesn't feel the rage and sadness beneath the pattern hasn't actually transformed. They've just upgraded their defense mechanism from unconscious giving to conscious intellectualizing. The real work happens in the body. In the moments of sitting with an urge to help someone and choosing to stay still. In the physical discomfort of watching someone struggle and allowing them to find their own way through it. In the strange sensation of having free time and no one to rescue and not knowing what to do with your own hands. There's a phenomenon Jung observed in patients who made it through this entire process, and it's the part that gives this story its unexpected ending. The empaths who survive the full transformation, the withdrawal, the reckoning, the rebuilding, don't become less empathic. They become empathic in a completely different way. The old empathy was porous. It had no membrane, no filter. Everything came in and the empath absorbed it all and tried to metabolize other people's pain through their own body. The new empathy has structure. It has edges. It can perceive without absorbing. It can witness without intervening. It can love without hemorrhaging. Jung would have called this the emergence of a differentiated self, a psyche that can feel deeply without losing its center. The old empath was like a sponge in the ocean, taking in everything until they were waterlogged and sinking. The new empath is more like a vessel. They can hold water, pour it out deliberately, and remain intact. The capacity didn't diminish. The relationship to the capacity transformed. And here's what's remarkable about the empaths who reach this stage. They actually become more helpful than they ever were before. Because the old helping was reactive, driven by anxiety, by the need to fix, by the terror of being dispensable. It was often more about the empath's need to give than the other person's need to receive. The new helping is selective and intentional. When they extend their hands now, they know exactly what they're offering, and exactly what it costs, and exactly where the line is. And that clarity makes their presence more powerful, not less. The people who receive this new kind of empathy can feel the difference even if they can't name it. There's a groundedness to it, a solidity. The empath isn't leaning forward desperately trying to make it better. They're standing firmly in their own center and offering what they can from a place of genuine choice rather than compulsion. That kind of presence is actually what heals people. The old version, the frantic, boundaryless giving, often kept people dependent. This version helps them stand on their own. Jung spent his career arguing that the path to psychological wholeness runs directly through the parts of ourselves we most want to avoid. For the empath, the avoided truth is that their giving was never purely altruistic. It was tangled up with fear, with old wounds, with the desperate childhood belief that love must be earned through self-erasure. Coming face to face with that truth is agonizing, and it's also the door that opens everything. If you're the one sitting in the driveway right now, hands on the wheel, unable to go inside because there's nothing left, I want you to know that what you're feeling is the beginning of something, even though right now it feels like an ending. The exhaustion you're carrying isn't a character flaw. It's your psyche finally telling you the truth about a pattern that was never sustainable. And the fact that it hurts this much is evidence of how long you carried it, how much you gave, and how deeply you loved, even when that love wasn't returned in kind. Jung believed that the wound is where the light enters. He also believed that entering takes courage most people will never find. You're finding it. You're sitting in the driveway with empty hands, and you're starting to wonder if those hands might be allowed to hold something of your own. They are. They always were. The world will tell you that your tiredness is a problem to solve, that you need to recharge so you can get back to giving. Jung would tell you something different. He'd tell you that the tiredness is the message, and the message is, you were never meant to carry all of this. You were meant to set some of it down, feel how light your hands become, and discover what you actually want to reach for when the choice is finally yours. Whatever you're reaching toward right now, a deeper understanding of your own patterns, a framework for this work that doesn't require you to figure everything out alone, that reaching matters. Our guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 reflection exercises built on Jung's teachings, designed for exactly this moment. The moment when you're ready to stop pouring out and start looking in. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.